Well, hello everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to the 127th episode of Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I am the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today, as I always say, we have another incredible and highly accomplished guest who embodies many of the things that I feel so strongly about in the world of advocacy and speaking up and pushing forward for change. Denise Rucker Krepp, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me today.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come on the show. And just a few quick admin notes before we get started. If you're joining me from YouTube, please be sure to subscribe. We will be taking comments throughout the call. If I don't get to your comment while we're having the broadcast, feel free to leave something in there that we can look to later, and we'll make sure to get back to you. As I always say, this is an open conversation. One of the reasons I do these things live is because I believe strongly, as I know Denise does as well, in transparency. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by reading a little bit about her, and then we're just going to get into the questions. So Denise uses the power of language to speak out against systemic problems facing the armed services with a steadfast dedication to shining that light in dark places. She is a consummate professional, and her voice has led to far-reaching action, consistently delivering her points with respect and reverence for the organizations she's calling on for change. She sets this example. I saw it earlier today in some interviews about crime, backing up her positions using compelling arguments and, as I saw, sound factual information. She is an Army brat who started her career as a Coast Guard officer. She then served as a Transportation Security Administration attorney, congressional staffer, federal agency chief counsel, adjunct professor, private sector lobbyist, and locally elected DC official. Wow, so much. She's currently the DC ambassador for the Military Women's Memorial, and I did see an interview earlier with Phyllis, the director and CEO of that. I think that's amazing that you did her story, and a National Maritime Historical Society trustee. Welcome again.
Thank you.
So I usually start off these interviews with some basic questions about where were you born and
Mhm.
raised, and what led you into a life of service.
Yeah. So I'm an Army brat. I was born in Atlanta when my dad
Mhm.
was going to school at Emory for medicine. And like every Army brat that I know, we moved every 2 to 3 years.
Right.
So I was a graduate of two different high schools. I started out in West Germany.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, yeah, I lived in Heidelberg, which was I love the town. Absolutely amazing town. Finished up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Again,
Mhm.
Army.
Yep.
And how did I become a Coast Guard
Right, because
officer?
you would have thought you'd go into the
Right.
army.
Yeah, yeah. I had a father that was West Point grad, and who kept saying to me in high school, "I will buy you a car if you will go to West Point." And I was like, "That sounds great," and I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I am not joining the military. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. That was 4 years. Then I was in law school at the University of Miami, and I decided to work for the Coast Guard one summer. And I looked around and I was like, well, this is kind of a cool service. It's on the water. And
Mhm.
I can remember calling up my parents. They're like, but wait a second. My mom and my dad were both Army officers. Like, you're going what? You do what? I said, I'm going to be a JAG officer and I'm going to be in the Coast Guard. They're like, huh, wrong service, but we'll support it. But okay, that's fine. So that's how I ended up in the Coast Guard, by telling my Army parents that I didn't want to wear green.
Well,
Yeah.
it sounds like they were happy for the decision, and, as you joined the military and went into the JAG community, what were some of your observations about the JAG Corps for the Coast Guard?
Well, I joined the JAG Corps and the Coast Guard because it was a small organization where you immediately have responsibility. So,
Right.
if you go into the Navy or the Marine Corps or the Army, the Air Force, there's a lot of training and there's a lot of grunt work as a very lowly Lieutenant JG 02 that I was. But in the Coast Guard, you're immediately thrown in. And so I
Mhm.
spent 2 years writing legislation because I had done that prior to going to law school. And I had, captains and admirals listening to me as an O2 going like, huh, well, this makes sense. This is good. And I don't think I would have had that responsibility if I'd gone to another service. And then I
Mhm.
took what was called an out of specialty billet to go to the Office of International Affairs. Because in the Coast Guard, all officers are line officers. So
Mhm.
you can come into and out of the JAG community. And I went in the summer of 2000 thinking that it was going to be an interesting experience, but I had no idea that 9/11 was going to happen in the middle of this. So I went from working on pretty standard IMO issues of safety and fisheries to all of a sudden helping stand up the port security part of the Coast Guard. I mean, we
Wow.
flipped on 9/11. We literally flipped from being fisheries and immigration to all of a sudden being responsible for port security around the United States. And it was just an amazing opportunity to be there right at the ground floor watching as the Coast Guard stood everything up.
That's
It
so
was, it was
cool, and
amazing.
then
Yeah.
to have that opportunity to see kind of how history changed the landscape of a
Yes.
branch based on current
Yes.
events.
Dramatically. Yes. Yeah.
Wow. So, how long did you stay in the Coast Guard? Oh,
I
there's the kitty.
there's the cat. 4 years. So I had gotten engaged in February of '01, getting married in December, and had thought about staying in. I was getting married to a Navy SWO, and then the war starts, and I had grown up with an Army father who had constantly deployed for every war known to mankind. If it was Christmas, I knew what conflict it was. If it was Easter, I knew what conflict it was because my
Mm,
father was always deploying. And I looked at the husband and said, yeah, co-location, two different branches, two different jobs, that does not
yep,
make for a successful marriage. And
you're
I
right.
wanted a successful marriage, so I got out and he stayed in. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, was there something that happened while you were in the Coast Guard that impacted the which we'll get into later, the
Mhm.
advocacy that you are so passionate about when it comes to the Coast Guard and their issues?
Uh, a little bit, but that advocacy actually started in college.
Wow.
Uh,
So how did that start for you?
okay, so let's call it. I'm an advocate for sexual assault survivors,
Mhm.
and that started in the summer of 1993. A friend
Mm.
of mine was violently raped by a serial rapist. He was a drug dealer, and it was a pretty traumatic crime. And I got a firsthand look because of my friend of how the judicial system worked. And this is very important because I saw what I can only describe now as a miracle. The police got involved, the FBI got involved, uh, the individual was found. It was very difficult to find him, but they found him. He
Mhm.
was arrested, he was prosecuted, and he went to jail for 20 years.
Wow.
So I saw a system
That
that
worked.
worked.
Hmm.
So violent criminal went away for a long time. Uh, but when I got back to college that fall, I asked several friends of mine, "Hey, has anybody been raped?" And more than one of my friends' hands went up.
Hmm.
And then I asked the next question, "Well, was the guy prosecuted?" And the hands went down.
Yeah.
And I went to a civilian college. And that memory stayed in my mind. And then I was in law school and I became a rape advocate there because of things I saw in law school. A friend of mine was raped by the football team, by a member of the football team. And she tried to get help from the university, and the university said, "But he's a football player. Why would you want to press charges?"
Wow.
Yep.
That's so
And
shameful.
yep. And I kept thinking, but I had already seen a rape that was prosecuted. Why is that rape not being prosecuted? And then I saw some stuff going on when I was in the Coast Guard. So I came in the summer of '98. So this predates Me Too. I mean, there were no
Mhm.
female admirals in the Coast Guard. There were very few female captains. We were all mentoring each other. We were advising each other in the bathroom, we being women, on what to do with sexual harassment.
Right. I came in
And
'96, I
yeah,
remember.
oh yeah, the good old days. And so we came up with this scheme where if the guys were sexually harassing you, the first thing you'd start saying is, "How's your mother doing today?"
Yeah.
How's your sister doing today? How are they doing?
Right,
So
right.
it wasn't a direct, like, other words, back off. It was a soft way to deflect. Uh, but it was just like an everyday occurrence. I mean, I was in Coast Guard
Right.
headquarters. I am 5'10". So when you are 5'10" without shoes on and you're 6 feet with heels and you kind of, you're
Yeah.
24, 25, you kind of stick out. So I was the beneficiary of a lot of sexual harassment. Yeah.
Yeah, man, you know, you're just bringing up some things too. Like I think that even when Me Too happened, and you can even go back to some of my comments on the female officers page. I didn't even think that it's a Facebook group for
Hmm.
female Navy officers, and I was really even in denial that it was a thing because I had just been around that culture where you just accepted it and you put up with it,
Hmm.
and it didn't even occur to me back then that this was something that you could fight, uh, and because so few people did, and even,
Yeah.
my one of my dearest friends is actually one of my best friends is on the call, and she's just thanking you for your story, and she's saying kind of something along the similar lines with the prosecution on how that is so rare that you saw that as an example and as a template, I'm sure, to say,
Yes.
"This is what right looks like. Why isn't right being applied in other cases?"
Yes. And then I, again, back of my mind, what I had seen, what was right. Fast forward in my career, I become the chief counsel of the Maritime Administration, and I get notified of sexual assaults. I
Mhm.
was notified of male and female sexual assaults at the school, student on student, possibly professor on student, sexual assaults occurring when the students were out at sea year.
Mhm.
And a whistleblower came forward. And under my signature as chief counsel, I asked for an inspector general investigation into those sexual assaults. And that was the summer of 2011. So that
Okay.
was 6 years before Harvey Weinstein and Me Too kicked off.
Okay. And what happened as a result of you asking for investor that
what,
investigation?
what happened? Let's see. I was forced to resign.
Really?
Yeah. So I asked for the IG investigation in the fall of 2011. The next day, Ray LaHood, I was told that Ray LaHood wanted to talk to me, and I tried to call into the meeting, and it was screaming and yelling, and how dare I besmirch the crown jewel of the department, and how I dare I do all this stuff, and I'm thinking, these are crimes, buddy. What do you mean, how
Right.
dare I? Kids are being hurt. These kids could be my kids at some point. So he told me at that point that I could no longer do anything with the school, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I had to hand all my files over, and I had to be mentored because clearly I didn't know how to be a successful chief counsel. So I handed over my files, and I dutifully sat once a week with the deputy general counsel of the Department of Transportation to be tutored on how to be a successful lawyer. And then in February of 2012, I was called into another room and I was given a choice. I could either be fired that day or I could resign. I could submit a resignation letter.
Mhm.
Uh, and they wished me well in my endeavors.
What did they say was the reason why you had to resign? Did they just come up with, like, charges or ways, like little
No, the secretary had lost confidence in my ability to lead, lost confidence in my ability to lead because of my request for the IG investigation. So I
it's
was
just
the
so blatantly
number.
obvious
Oh, I know.
retaliation.
Yeah. I mean, and I was the number 3 person in the agency. So that's the equivalent of the chief counsel for the Navy and the chief counsel for the Army. That's who
Mhm.
I was. They took me out. And it was interesting. I was banned from a federal building. Ray LaHood banned me from the Department of Transportation for the entirety that the time that he was secretary.
This is shocking.
Why? This is what happens. It,
Wow.
it, and when
And
I
at that point, did you think to yourself, "I need to fight this," or what were you thinking at the time?
Well, so let's share that I was a political appointee. So I served at the whim of the President of the United States. And I knew that I was going to be blackballed by my own
Mhm.
party. I'm a Democrat. So my job was to get a job. But in order to do that, under the ethics rules, every job that I applied to for the 3 months that I was on, the 3 months that they granted me before they completely, again, resignation, I get 3 months to be on the payroll, fired, day of, out. So for those 3 months, the department's ethics lawyer got to review every job that I applied for. And guess what? I didn't get a single one of them.
Right.
So
Mhm.
didn't get that. And because of the stress, I had a miscarriage.
God.
So I'm
Oh,
a
that
little passionate about this issue because of the personal cost that I have paid. And I
right.
don't want anybody else to pay for the cost that I paid.
So
That
now
that
it
shouldn't
makes
happen.
sense that this now tell me a little bit about in so this happened in 2012, but the
Mhm.
ongoing issues right
Yeah,
now that are
yeah, yeah.
happening, when did those start to manifest themselves to become where they are today? I mean, because there must have been a
Uh,
gap between 2012 and to where you started doing the advocacy?
go for about 2 years. Well,
Okay.
actually, 1 year. So in 2013, Senator Gillibrand was
Mhm.
proposing legislation that was going to remove the chain of command. And I saw it and I pondered and I thought about it and I thought about what had happened, what I had seen in the Coast Guard and what I had experienced as the Maritime Administration Chief Counsel. And then there was a case that was at the Naval Academy. It was a rape case. And one of the female victims was put on the stand and was asked by the defense attorney, "Do you feel like a hoe?" And
Oh my god.
and my head was
I
exploding. And I
know.
mean,
That's
it's sort
so
of like you see it in the
terrible.
cartoons where you're like, yeah, that's what my
How
head
can you
did.
even be allowed to ask that?
Right. So to me, I could let my head continue to explode, or I could put pen to paper. And I wrote an essay that was entitled "Female Military Personnel Aren't Whores."
Mhm.
And the editor's like, "Are you sure you won that title?" And I was like, "Yep, I sure do."
Yeah,
Because we're not whores,
right.
and we shouldn't be asked if we're hosts. So based on that essay, I was invited twice to testify in January 2014 before a congressionally mandated panel about military sexual assault. So it was Army, Navy, Air Force, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Denise.
How
And
interesting.
so, because there are, well, now six, but at the time, five branches. And I
Mhm.
wanted to make sure that the Coast Guard story was told. So it was me coming in as a Coast Guard officer and the Maritime Administration chief counsel. So I was the only coastee the first time, shared my story, thinking that surely when I shared my story that I've just shared with you, something was going to change. And nothing happened. And it was behind closed doors. And I was like, where's everybody? I don't understand. And they said, well, the press isn't allowed to be here. I was like, well, that's kind of a whitewash, isn't it? But let's call this. It's a
Yeah.
whitewash. So I went to social media and I called it a whitewash. Newsweek picked it up. And then for some reason, another week went by and I got another invitation to testify again. This time CNN's taping me. And I shared the exact same story. And again,
Mhm.
I think, well, surely
Something's
I've
gonna
now
happen. Yeah.
something's going to happen. I mean, it's January 2014, but I learned that the world wasn't ready.
Right.
So the world wasn't ready, and fast forward to about, oh gosh, 2022, I think, was Midshipman X. So
Wow, that's a huge gap. So
yeah,
8
yeah,
years later,
yeah,
8
yeah.
years from when you first started.
Eight years of what I was
Mhm.
first publicly. I mean, unofficially, I was doing things, but writing. Yeah, it was
Mhm.
8 years. So Midshipman X is coming, telling her story about sexual assault in the merchant marine industry, and I'm, again, my head's exploding, going, "Hey, come on! I was telling you guys this back in 2011, 10 years
Mm.
prior to that."
Yeah.
So started writing, and then when CNN published the stories last summer
Yep, I
about the
remember that.
assaults in the Coast Guard, I just Oh, it's so angry.
Yeah.
Just so angry. Yeah.
To yeah, because I mean, the gist of that story, for those of us who haven't seen the story, from my understanding, is that they knew for years that this
Mhm.
was going on,
Yep.
and that there were cases that just did not receive any kind of adjudication. Is that
Yeah,
or
yeah.
were just dropped, or
Oh,
and and
both,
th-
both.
and there were reports about this that they kept hidden and didn't want to release.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about my relationship to this little problem. So my years of service overlap with the years in which cases were not prosecuted,
Mhm.
which to me was troubling
Right.
because that tells me that if something had happened to me, there were going to be no consequences. Sexual harassment aside, that was
Mhm.
bad enough. But if I had been raped on active duty in the Coast Guard, clearly nothing was going to happen. Okay, that didn't make me feel good. And then when I found out that they had not shared information about it, I looked at the years and went, huh, well, that's fascinating. Because in those years that you weren't sharing, I was doing oversight over the Coast Guard. As senior counsel in the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee, I had the Coast Guard portfolio. And
And
that's
that
where
wasn't being
I,
shared. Yeah.
no. So I got onesies, twosies. Hey, Denise, there was a rape aboard the Eagle. Hey, Denise, there was a rape in a foreign port. Hey, Denise. Okay, onesie, twosies. And by the way, you know who was making those phone calls, directing that? Was Carl Schultz. So Carl Schultz at that time was in '06. When this report was not shared with Congress, Carl Schultz was the commandant of the Coast Guard.
Hmm.
So I know that player. Melissa Burt, who was involved in the decision making process, who was the first female Coast Guard chief counsel, was the woman who recruited me into the Coast Guard in '97. So when I realized that people that I had known for 25 years who brought me into this service did not do their job, I started writing again and saying that they needed to be held accountable.
Right.
So
But what do you think this was on the part of the Coast Guard? Do you think it was that they lacked the resources and the training and the money, to do this? Or do you think they were just afraid of the blowback of having all these cases? And then, I mean, what do you where do you think all this I try to always assume
mhm.
that people have noble intent, and that even these people that do these things or that pass these things through the system, there's mitigating factors that I think are important to talk about. And what do you think are some of those reasons why these things get ignored?
So we're going to have to go back about 30 years before I get to today.
Okay.
So in the early '90s, there was an admiral called Versailles. And Admiral Versailles was the chief counsel of the Coast Guard. Then Admiral Versailles becomes the superintendent of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy.
Okay.
As Coast Guard chief counsel, he was responsible for prosecuting crimes. As Coast Guard superintendent, he should have been calling his successor and say, prosecute the crimes that are occurring on this campus.
Mhm.
And based on the documentation that I have seen, very little of those conversations occurred.
Hmm.
So I am struggling to understand, as a lawyer and a former chief counsel myself, why a former Coast Guard chief counsel was not ensuring that crimes were prosecuted in the '90s when
Mhm.
he was superintendent. I am struggling to understand that one right now. That one is very hard for me to understand because a crime is a crime. Rape didn't suddenly become a crime in 2024. Rape
Right.
was a crime in the '90s when this was going on. So was there a lack of desire to prosecute? Um, I don't know, but those are questions we should be asking.
They are.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We,
And
we,
I also wonder, I've had this talk with Jocelyn Stewart. She's a defense attorney, for the arm or does was a prior Army JAG, and now is a civilian defense attorney. And she brings up a lot of issues that I've thought about too over the years when it comes to sexual assault and sexual crimes, and
Mm.
that is, you know, people's testimony, that is evidence. I mean, a lot of times people will say, "Well, we need proof that a crime occurred." Well,
Mhm.
there's witnesses, who talked to the victim around the time that this happened. There are, like I said, there's the victim if they're willing to speak. I mean, you probably understand all this more than I do, but, I think in a lot of these cases, you're not gonna have this hard evidence that people
Right,
expect. And
right.
so it really comes down to a jury getting the opportunity to hear both sides, as both sides
A
deserve to be heard
Absolutely, yes,
and to be litigated properly.
and it didn't even go to litigation. So there are
That's
cases
infuriating.
at the Coast Guard Academy where they just let the individual who committed rape leave and then go to civilian schools. So you
Right.
have women that are survivors and survivors for 30, 40, 50 years that are living with this trauma, and the individuals who committed it got away with it. And so that's my problem right now is that we had cover up for the first crime. Then we had a review that happened in 2014, which re traumatizes survivors.
Yep.
And they were told that certain things were going to happen and didn't. And now we've got 5 different congressional committees and an IG investigating because they didn't do the report. And so the questions I would be asking the Coast Guard, if I was in my former seat as a House staffer, is you have said that you have addressed the individuals, that you reviewed all these cases and you dealt with certain individuals. Well, there were no prosecutions. So if there were no prosecutions, how did you deal with it? Did you let them retire with an honorable discharge? Is that what you did? Is this individual now getting retirement benefits for the rest of his or her life? Because
Yeah.
that's the way you solve this? Because that's not a solution to rape.
No,
Letting
it's
somebody honorably retire is
yeah.
not the solution to rape.
I do think that part of this is just negligence and being unwilling to prosecute because of the
Yes.
resources that
Uh, uh,
prosecution
well,
expends.
no, 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 no,
You
no,
don't
no,
think so?
no,
Okay.
no, no.
Alright.
I think it's we just didn't prosecute. It's not resources. And trust me, I managed a legal shop. I understand what resources look like. It's not finite. We're not printing money in the back room. I
Right.
understand that. It's a desire. And that's part of the reason I was advocating for 10 years to remove the chain of command,
Yeah.
because you cannot have the chain of command looking at both. You have to have a neutral party. And
I
that's
agree.
why I was very supportive of Congress pulling this out, putting independent prosecutors in and saying, go forth and do a job.
Mhm. It remains to be seen how that's gonna play out too. I mean,
Yeah,
we've only had that in place, I think, since late last year, and
late
so
November. Yes.
mhm,
Yeah.
we'll have to see if now we get more prosecutions or more
Yeah.
cases that go to court martial. I mean, I
Well,
think that's
yes,
right. That's
yes, yes. And by the way, everything I learned here is what I then use as an elected official in DC. So I don't want folks to say, hey, the military is the only one with the problem. No, 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 no. Please don't think that. I mean, this issue of rape is the reason why there is a case called Krepp versus the United States. I mean, yes, I had to
what is
sue the Department of Justice. I sued them in 2016 to find out how many rape cases they prosecuted each year. So I got elected. So after I leave the Maritime Administration and I
yeah,
become a private sector lobbyist, I also became an elected official. And my
you're county
neighbor,
commissioner, right?
no, it's called
Oh,
Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. It's because we are a city district, it's a little
okay.
different. So we're ANC. So I represented about 2,000 people. And in October of 2015, my neighbor was raped by a serial rapist. I mean, he was a pretty vile individual. Uh, but I made sure that the miracle that I had seen in 93 occurred in 2016. I made sure that he was found. I made sure, working with the police, that he was arrested. I made sure, using positional power, which I learned how to do that in the military, to sit in court to make sure he was prosecuted successfully and then was sentenced to 60 years. 60.
Fantastic, Denise.
So I
Wow.
made sure, but along the way, I asked the Department of Justice, how many rapes are you prosecuting? And I got told, we don't know. I said, oh, I don't think I believe that one. I said, again, we don't know. Then I FOIA'd, we don't know. Appealed, we don't know. Great. When are you going to figure out how many rapes you're
Oh,
prosecuting
God.
in Washington, D.C.? Let's come on. Let's figure this out. It's not that hard. So that ends up in a lawsuit. And only because this is my world, I live in Capitol Hill. I reached out and I said, hey, does anybody want to help me? I'm doing this. And I had friends who apparently worked for Senator Grassley. And the U.S. attorney at that time was up for nomination, for confirmation. And they went and said, well, why are you making Miss Krepp do this? This doesn't make any sense. And the DOJ originally denied it. And then Senator Grassley, and I learned a lot from him. It's like, I don't think you understand. If you don't answer her questions, we're not confirming you. So with help from Congress, I got the answers. So they gave the information to Congress while in court they were still denying it. It's great. And guess what? The judge that heard the case is now the newest Supreme Court justice. But yeah, so I had to go to court. No, you can't.
You really can't.
But everything I learned that I'd seen in prior lives, I used to ensure that my residents, because they were mine for 8 years, were protected and had the data they need to feel safe and secure.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And everything that you're saying just so strikes a chord with me. And I'm sure with some of my audience. I mean, this is Jeff Gores is on the call, and he's just like, yeah, this is how agencies protect themselves. Happens to most whistleblowers. So he's talking more about the retaliation piece. And organizations are reluctant to hold themselves accountable. And my earlier point and what I was going to go back to is the idea that you used, and I think all of us as advocates do this, we use these prior experiences and these times that we saw either when things went right or when they went terribly wrong. And we say, okay, that didn't go as well as we wanted, or that didn't really happen in the way that it should have. And then you keep building on those advocacy skills, because you start to realize that even if you go after something, and I've done this one way, there's another way. There's another avenue like you did. That's so great that you said, okay, I'm not going to get this through the FOIA method or this other method in court, but maybe the congressional hearings can put pressure on the leaders to say you're not going to be confirmed unless you give over this information. And when you found out how many rape prosecutions the Justice Department performed, what was the outcome of that information? What did they say?
Depressing.
Yeah.
Just depressing. And it was, again, my case was before Me Too. Krepp versus the United States was it was decided in December of 2016. And so there are a couple things I've learned, because you got to learn from past experiences. I was by myself at that time. I sought help from the DC Council. I was like, hey, don't you guys want this information? Wouldn't it be helpful to you? And nobody popped up.
Are you talking about like the DC Bar Association?
No, I'm talking about the DC Council. So in DC, we have the mayor, and then we have the DC Council, the City Council. Yes, my apologies. Yeah, the City Council. I was like, don't you guys want to help me?
Yeah.
I mean, you're the ones getting paid. You're the ones who've got staff. I'm simply an unpaid,
and they have
no staff.
on their
And
staff.
they have an attorney. They have the DC Attorney General, and they're like, no, but you just keep on doing it and just keep us informed. I'm like, thanks, guys. This is just epic.
Yeah.
But so learned that. So let's fast forward to 2023, when everything gets shared about the Coast Guard. I start seeing things from people who are like, well, this is not cool. This is not cool. And we start finding each other on social media. And that's how I became part of this group of female Coast Guard veterans, and we're collectively using our voices to advocate for change. So it went from me being by myself, learned a
Mm-hmm.
lot of lessons, to now me plus a bunch of other amazing ladies who also had their own experiences. And
Mm-hmm.
we joined forces. And so for the past, gosh, I don't know, about 4 or 5 months, we've been sending all these letters to Congress. Like, first of all, you have to say thank you. My mother always said you have to say thank you. So we're
Of
writing thank you notes. Thank you, Congress, for holding oversight hearings. Okay,
course.
got it. Thank you. And then it's, hey, based on our experience, these are questions we encourage you to ask because we are collectively standing up. So we're doing this as female veterans, officer and enlisted, by the way. That's the important part of this. Officer and enlisted standing together. And then we're also pulling in male allies. Because one important thing for folks to realize is that the victims weren't just women, they
Right.
were men and women that were being assaulted. So we're just kind of working together for a solution. And I think that's important as veterans because we want the Coast Guard to succeed. I mean, we all invested time, effort, hours, years in a service who has a mission we believe in. We just have a lot of bad apples that need to be kicked out and addressed. That's
Yeah,
kind of how we
well,
view it.
that's my next question is what are the asks and what does justice look like at this point?
Got to break it down for a couple of things. So, a couple of the women have filed for their files at the academy.
Mhm.
And the Coast Guard has come back and provided some pretty heavily redacted documents. Well, that's not justice.
Mhm.
Justice looks like your full file. You know, when these men and women reported this, the academy officials in the 80s, 90s, aughts today, where's the paperwork that went with it?
Mhm.
How are those cases resolved? So they need to be provided the full documentation. And then we've got to look at things, for example, there are individuals currently in zone for '05 and '06. Well, some of those individuals in zone for '05 and '06 were individuals that were accused of rape and the Coast Guard did nothing about.
Mhm.
So how do you look at that one? So that's the current ones. Then we need to start looking at the admirals who participated in the cover-up
Right.
and making recommendations that individuals who have retired be subpoenaed.
You're calling for probably the most comprehensive investigation I've ever heard of in the military.
Oh, going for one more. Hold the admirals who were involved
Mhm.
on active duty. Don't let them out. So
Mhm.
I would argue that last summer, at least one critical admiral was allowed to retire.
Right.
Hold them.
The only 2 things that I can even compare, and I'm just making notes because it just both these stories, I mean, the only 2 things I can compare to what you're talking about and the scale of what you're talking about is tailhook and fat lettered. I can't think of anything else that
Mhm.
we've dealt with as a military that comes even close to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and tailhook is a good example, and that tailhook is frustrating to me because tailhook, especially because you and I both came in after tailhook, there were promises made that
Mhm.
this would stop. There were promises made to those of us who came in the mid to late '90s that we wouldn't be serving in this environment, and those promises were not kept. They weren't kept to us. But then you have to look at Paula Coughlin, the woman who set this off. I've talked to Paula. She is an amazing lady.
I need to have
And
her on the show. Yeah.
please do. I mean,
Mhm.
she is just a badass
Yeah,
who
I've seen
cares.
interviews with her.
She carries the scars, um, and she has carried them now for 30 years because of a lack of leadership.
Mhm.
But she wasn't the only one. And through my journey of 30 years, I learned that it was not just Navy individuals, that it was Air Force individuals who are also bearing these scars. Because Tailhook was not just a Navy event, it was Navy and Air Force.
Mhm.
And we got to think about that.
Right. And I think that sometimes when we talk about these kinds of issues, many people try to say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? To try to distract from the issue, or they bring up as and as you so rightly said, these are not issues that are uh, plaguing just the Coast Guard. But I
Yes.
always feel that in life, you have to pick your battles and you
Hmm.
have to find those cases where you feel you can use your voice and use your expertise and your
Yeah.
experiences to drive home the greatest change. And it sounds like you've done exactly that. And so now, as you said, where's my notes? You said you had five committees and
Hmm.
one IG investigation. Is that still ongoing at this
Oh,
point?
yes. In fact,
Okay.
Senate Homeland sent a letter
Mhm.
ooh, 2 weeks ago to the Coast Guard saying that it should make available all the individuals involved in Operation Foul Anchor to committee staff next week.
Okay. So
Yes.
we, as the audience, will be tracking this very closely because I do think that this should be a historical case that
Mm.
all the branches look at and
Yes.
say, this is not right. We need to prosecute when these things happen, and we
Yes.
need to expand the resources and the time and the motivation, to hold people accountable for
Absolutely.
mistreating others. I mean, that's
Yes.
the bottom line. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and just know that there's people like myself that really admire you, and I'm sure even after this podcast, you'll have people that will follow up with you
Oh, thank
because
you.
I'll have put you in front of a new audience, and
Thanks.
hopefully others can see. I want to also transition to the fact that you're not only an advocate about sexual assault and you've done things in your community as a leader. You're also an advocate for stopping crime in your neighborhood. Tell me a little
Hmm.
bit about how that came about. I'm assuming it was around the time that you were an elected official that you started that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it goes back to the rape.
Mhm.
Everything in my life sadly goes back to a
Mm.
rape.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So the DC, sorry, we'll call it a city council. So DC council, city
Mhm.
council, was passing these laws about the same. They passed the first one about the same time that my neighbor was raped, and the first one was going to say, "Hey, you've committed a rape under the age of 21. Your brain hasn't formed, so we should give you a lesser sentence." Like so
What?
many four-letter blue words went through my mind. It was like, so I had to become an advocate of no,
Mhm.
rape victims or sorry, rape survivors do not get to turn back the clock. Absolutely not. Just
Right.
absolutely not. No, not going to happen. Uh, and then they ignored me. So they said, "All right, we'll go halfsies with you, Denise. We'll make individual who commits rape serve their full sentence. Well, serve part of their time, but be eligible after 15 years for early release." So you remember the guy I told you that got 60 years for raping my neighbor?
Mhm.
Yeah, he's eligible for early release because of the DC Council after 15.
Wow.
Yeah, way to stand up for rape survivors. And then they decided to expand that little like get out early card to individuals under the age of 24 because again they said, "Oh, geez, brains haven't been formed." Like, no, but no, this is no. Uh, but what made my head just like, all right, can't handle this anymore. They tried to pass a bill last year. It was oh gosh, no, it's been a year now, year before, that said that anybody, regardless of age, if you commit rape or you commit murder, essentially all you have to do is 15 years because you will be eligible to get out. So it doesn't matter that you have been sentenced. I mean, you could be a serial rapist sentenced to 70 years, but just do 15 and you've been reformed and you can get out. No,
Was this a way to just free up the prisons? Like, what was the motive?
no, 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 no. This was a way for the DC Council to say, well, people need to understand that rapists and murderers are good people. Yeah,
Just a soft on crime approach that
it,
everybody
it,
deserves a second chance, that
it
kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah, and it was just no, no, not having advocated for rape survivors for 30 years. Wasn't going to listen to me. So on my way out the door, I wrote a letter to Congress. Again, I'm a Democrat. And I sent a letter to Democrats and Republicans saying that you can't do this. You've got to overturn this. So in DC, the laws, you've got the DC council that passes laws and the mayor that passes laws. But because we are a district, the laws then get to be approved by Congress. And the members of Congress looked at this and went and said, yeah, that's not smart. So Andrew Clyde from Georgia took the lead on the House side, and he got the House bipartisan. In fact, I think it was the only bipartisan bill last year to say, nope, that's not going to happen.
Good.
And then the Senate looked at the situation and said, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And by the way, don't forget, I've had a rape on my block. I've had a carjacking in front of my house. I've had a murder half a block from the house. I've had multiple shootings. My kids know how to hit the floor when the gunshots go out. I mean, and I live 18 blocks from the Capitol. Okay. So I'm not in an unknown area, and I'm half a block from the DC Armory. So House vetoes, Senate vetoes, and then the president vetoes that bill. So in my community, yes, I am known as the woman who killed the DC Council soft on crime bill because of rape.
Oh, I love it. Like I was telling you earlier in the call, we have somebody in my neighborhood in Norfolk who reminds me so much of you when it comes to these things. And she is just a force to be reckoned with, like yourself, where she's just not going to tolerate people who sadly just have no regard for others. I mean, and that's really the bottom line is, and I do believe that in some cases people are not, sadly, they are unable to be rehabilitated. There are those people, and we have to account for them, and we have to protect the public when we've done everything we can to rehabilitate somebody. That if their mind is poisoned by a certain mindset, sometimes there is no hope, sadly. And then it becomes, well, how do we protect the public from this person and the further damage that they can cause? So good on you for that. So tell me a little bit on a lighter side, some of the things that you do. I know you do a lot for like the Women's Memorial, and you're, I think, a historical trustee, I think is what I read. Tell me a little bit about some of that stuff.
Okay. So I'm the DC ambassador for the Military Women's Memorial. So I have to ask you, have you shared your story with the Military Women's Memorial?
I know there's a website that you go on and you register, and my friend Olivia Nunn is also a very big advocate for them. And I also need to have Phyllis on the S.O.S podcast. So she is welcome anytime. I follow her on LinkedIn and absolutely just love her content. She's so professional and wonderful. And when I go back to DC, which I will at some point, especially when I get back into the States, that might even be, this is a sidebar, but I can't wait to be back in the States and be able to do in-person podcasts, like go see people and visit them and set up a show. I think that'll be amazing. So she would be someone I'd love to talk to.
And Phyllis is, I mean, she's in charge of the memorial, and it is our memorial. So women have served in the military since 1917 in non-nursing roles. There were nurses prior to, but we've been around. We've been serving even before we could vote. So to see a memorial for the women who came before us, our mothers, our grandmothers, in some cases our great grandmothers, it's awe-inspiring. So I love volunteering for that organization. I love volunteering for the National Maritime Historical Society. So I get to talk about history. Again, maritime history for me is critical. If we're going to understand the future, we got to look to the past. I love doing that. And then what makes me happiest is rhubarb. I was like, what? You and rhubarb? I love getting my hands dirty. I am a gardener at heart. and so I am very, very proud of my rhubarb that I grow in Washington, D.C. And people are like, what? You can do? I'm like, yeah, I grow rhubarb and peaches and strawberries and corn. We had a pumpkin grow up my crepe myrtle tree last year. So, I mean, I'm an avid gardener that just loves to play around in dirt. Yep.
I love it. Absolutely love it. Well, Denise, is there anything else that I haven't covered on or you haven't talked about that you'd like to have a moment to talk more on?
Yeah. So we started this conversation about voices. And people have listened to us, I don't know, my glasses are off, for about 49 minutes because we're using our voices. But everybody has one. And so the reason I agreed to do this today was I want to encourage folks to remember that they have voices and to use them. Sometimes it's hard to figure out how. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what you want to talk about. But if you have a passion in life, use your voice. We're given it for a reason, and we're all going to talk about different things, but use your voice to help others. And if it's not your voice, then use your pen. Sometimes people are better writing, but you are given the ability to write for a reason. And so just don't give that up. Don't sit on the sidelines. Don't say, oh, I can't do that. Because you always can.
Yes, you can.
And just do it. Don't hold yourself back. Like, I got to think deep thoughts before I do it. Just do it. Just use it.
And the more you do it, the better you get at it. So start and realize that the first few times you do it, you won't be very good at it. But the more that you do it, because people think that. I mean, I can't even tell you, Denise, how much more comfortable I am on camera now or professionally in my NATO job when I do media engagements like what I did last weekend because of the fact that I do a podcast every week and I use my voice. It makes me a better briefer at work. So absolutely, just start doing it and you'll get better over time.
Yes. And lastly, and I'm going to say this, make sure you write your story down. So while you are talking, record it. So part of the reason I'm able to share stories about the people I talk about is because they wrote it down. And then they wrote it in a book. And this is my little 30-second plug for my girlfriend, Colonel Lisa Carrington Furman. Oops,
Here,
this
let me
way,
I'm gonna
this way.
put you on full screen.
Yay, this way. All right, there we go. Oh,
there we go.
There we go. There's Lisa's book. Lisa wrote down a collection of stories from MST survivors. Write your story down, put it in a book, stick it in the library so that in 20 to 30 years, people will have the ability to read it. Make sure your story is preserved. Just like my friend Lisa did. Again, shout out to Lisa. I'm so proud of her. Because see, by the way, she won a silver medal award, and I'm so proud of her.
That's
and so
amazing.
Also give shout outs to your girlfriends. That's really important in life.
Oh my gosh. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Denise, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to go on full screen and do my quick closeout, but I will meet you back in just a couple of minutes. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining me this week. It's another amazing and insightful conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you have an amazing rest of your week as we roll into the Easter season coming up here in a couple more weeks. But with that, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a great night. Bye-bye now.